The New Testament, an authentic and reliable book. You may be surprised at this, but Luke in his Gospel and the Acts wrote over 1/4 of our entire New Testament. We don't often realize how much of the New Testament was written by one man. We think Paul wrote it all, and he did write a big chunk. But 1/4 of it was written, in fact, 27% to be exact, was written by Luke. And my point is this: if Luke is shown to be a reliable historian in his Gospels and Acts, we can trust his record of the life of Jesus and the early Christian church. I'm going to introduce you to two people. Some you may have met them, you may not have done. But the first one is Sir Charles William Ramsay. He was born in 1851, died in 1939. And he is in many ways, not in all ways, but in many ways, the New Testament equivalent of Robert Dick Wilson in the Old Testament. Because Ramsay was an archaeologist who spent his entire academic life digging around in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, and in Greece, the land of Paul's missionary travels. And his value to us is particularly significant, because unlike Robert Dick Wilson was a conservative evangelical. He believed the Bible, and that was the thrust of his work. Ramsay wasn't. He didn't come up that way. It was the sheer force of truth that changed his mind. He never became what you would know and I would know as a conservative evangelical. That wasn't in his thinking. He wasn't so much a theologian. He was a historian, and he was brilliant. As you can see, if you can read those on the screen, you can see the kind of person he was. And he was a very, very able man. And Ramsay's background is particularly significant because he studied under Ferdinand Bauer, a founder of the Tübingen University in Germany. And in studying under Bauer, and that name will be known to some of you in critical views of the New Testament, Ramsay accepted Bauer's view that the New Testament could not be relied on as a historical document, and that there were huge differences between the theology of Paul and the theology of Peter. Referring to the Old Testament, he admitted that he, and these are his words, worshipped Wellhausen, the German theologian and critic of the Old Testament. And that's his background. And so when he began his work, that's exactly what he expected to find. You wonder why he even bothered. But anyway, that's what he expected to find. Half a century later, after all his research and his working in the land of Paul's travels, he concluded this: Luke wrote with such judgment, skill, art, and perception of truth as to be the model of historical statement. Now, let me interject by saying there are a lot of people who will tell you, of course, at the time of the Old Testament and particularly the New Testament, they didn't have historians as we have. They didn't write history like we do. Herodotus and all those, they didn't write history as we do. We have historians that can be unbiased and can just aim at the truth, which is a complete nonsense, because there's no such thing as an unbiased historian. I'm not unbiased, and none of you are. Everybody has a bias. Only cabbages don't have a bias. So that's a nonsense statement. But alternatively, we need to remind people that actually many of the older ancient historians were very careful to say what history is, and history does matter. It needs to be accurate. Not all were, of course, and some were misguided and some were misled. But he discovered that Luke was a very accurate historian. He was a model of historical statement. I set out to look for truth on the borderland where Greece and Asia meet, and found it there in the Acts of the Apostles. This was his conclusion. You may press the words of Luke in a degree beyond any other historians, and they stand the keenest scrutiny and the hardest treatment. Christianity did not originate in a lie, and we can and ought to demonstrate this as well as believe it. Now, please understand, this is not a Robert Dick Wilson man. Ramsay never would have accepted particularly verbal inspiration. He wouldn't have used the word inerrancy because it wasn't even invented then, but that wouldn't have been his position. He was merely coming at it as a historian. Yes, he was a religious man, but he came at it as a historian. Now, Luke has never been shown to be inaccurate in his history, and he gives us minute details of history, some of which we will look at. And much of what he says matches known inscriptions of the first century. Now, these are my figures. You can go and do your own if you like, so I'm not vouching for their perfect accuracy. But in his Gospels and Acts, Luke refers to 114 identifiable places we can say, yeah, we know exactly where that is. 25 political, military, social, and religious events, all of which we are aware of. We know they happen. He refers to the famine in Judea, Acts 11, and the expulsion of the Jews from Rome under the Emperor Claudius, and both of those are confirmed by first century texts. He refers to 117 living people by name. Now, not all of them, but many of them are well known to history. Of course, some of the minor people are not, they're only known in the Bible. But he mentions so many people by name. Why? Well, I believe because Luke was consciously an accurate historian. He wanted us to know that what he was writing was accurate, and you can check him out. I believe, and I don't think there's really any doubt about this, Luke kept a notebook. You say, a notebook in the first century? Yes, a notebook. Here is a first century notebook. All you do is take a few very thin slithers of parchment or wood, and you punch a couple of holes in the bottom and you put a ring in it, and you've made let's call it a ring binder, a first century piece of technology. You see, books were, as we understand them, a codex, were only used in the first century. They weren't used before then. Well, the Chinese may have been, but nobody else was. And the Christians very quickly took them on. And there is no question at all, but Paul was using a notebook. You see, the Greeks didn't have a word for this new fangled piece of technology, this new iPad thing that people had, this tablet that they were using. So they used the Latin word membrane, from which we get our word membrane. And when Paul wrote to Timothy and said, "Oh, Timothy, by the way, when you bring some of my goods from my locker to me, would you remember to bring the scrolls and the parchments?" And the word parchments there is the word membrane. Paul said, "Would you bring the scrolls, but don't forget the notebooks?" Luke was using a notebook. So bear Ramsay in mind, and something I may repeat later, but it's worth knowing. F.F. Bruce and many others, and I concur with this, it is amazing how often modern critics writing on the New Testament never mention Ramsay, as if he doesn't exist. And they will raise critical questions that Ramsay answered a century ago. Why? Either because they're ignorant and should do their homework, and there's no excuse because you can go online and read all of Ramsay's work today, or they deliberately and willfully ignore what they don't want you to know. And I could illustrate that in question time. If you want to ask me that, I'll gladly illustrate that latter point for you. There's somebody else I want to introduce you to, and he's in a different way equally important, Simon Greenleaf. Ever heard of him? Well, he was one of the founders of Harvard School of Law. And he wrote a seminal book entitled A Treatise of the Law of Evidence. It is considered to be, even today, one of the finest legal treatises available, and I'm not a lawyer, but I understand it is still referred to today. Now, Simon Greenleaf actually wanted to show something about the evidence of the Gospels, because you may ask, what on earth has this got to do with the Gospel of Luke or the New Testament? Well, he wrote a treatise on the evidence of witnesses. This was nothing to do with the Bible, though he then converted it into showing how the Bible fits into this. But it was a legal document on the evidence of witnesses, and that's what the Gospels are. They are the evidence of witnesses. So follow this through. There are 5 statements that he makes which would be upheld in any court of law today, and it's worth using these in your apologetics. Documents have a right to be taken as a true account until or unless they are proved inaccurate. So you see, immediately you shift the position the other way round. I don't have to prove, actually, that the Gospels are true. You have to prove that they are untrue, because in law a document stands until it is proven untrue. The author has a right to be considered trustworthy unless proven otherwise. If I tell you something, you are under an obligation to believe me unless you can prove that I am an inveterate liar and you can't trust me. But if everything you know about me and everything people tell you about me is that Brian Edwards is a man of integrity, then you will believe me, and you're under an obligation to do so. The number of independent witnesses confirms the greater accuracy of the report. That's obvious, isn't it? 2 witnesses are more important than just 1, so long as the agreement of their evidence enhances the truth of the record. If they're all pretty much in the same line saying the same thing, then you can accept the record. And fifthly, their reliability is confirmed by known events. Now, those 5 statements are very important, and you can apply them now to the New Testament. They have never been proven inaccurate. That's the kind of thing we're trying to demonstrate. Never proven inaccurate. You may think they're inaccurate, you may not like them, but they've got to be proved inaccurate. The writers were known men of integrity. Everything we know about the writers of the New Testament, and I am just talking about the New Testament now, but that would be true of the Old, but everything we're talking about the New Testament, these are men of integrity. You have to show that they are not. You can't just stand up and say that man's a liar. You've got to show that he's a liar. There are 4 independent Gospels. I love this. You know, if God only gave us one Gospel record, let's say the Gospel of Luke, you know what the critics would say. Well, that's only Luke's view. He just made it up, didn't he? So God, in his providential wisdom, gave us 4. So what do the critics do? They spend all their time scouring all 4 to try desperately to find differences between them. You can't win, can you? I think it was Ramsay himself who said, I noticed that with the critics, that out of every defeat, they find some way of finding another victory. The agreement of their evidence enhances the truth of the report. They never contradict one another. People will dispute that statement, but it is absolutely true. I'm well aware, not of all, but many of the so-called contradictions. And I have a talk on the authenticity of the Bible, an authentic book, and I illustrate how easy it is to bring together 2 statements that seem to be utterly different from each other, but actually are both true. And I can do that from my own particular experience on an occasion. And then the reliability is confirmed by known events. Their historical details conform to known history, and that's about what we're going to see. So let's start with Luke's Gospel. Keep those in mind. They are important. Luke, as he begins his Gospel, I'm not going to read this, but just pick out, if you can, the eyewitnesses, the carefully investigated, so that you may know the certainty. Luke makes it clear what his purpose is. I'm going to be telling you the truth. I want you to have certainty about it. I've carefully investigated this. Now, this is even leaving out what many of us believe is the divine inspiration. That's a bad word, but we all have a technical understanding of it. The divine God-breathed scripture. Leaving even that aside, he set out to be a faithful historian. And when he wrote the Acts of the Apostles, he picks up on that right into Theophilus, and he says, I want to show you the many convincing proofs that were there. Now, Luke has never been shown to be inaccurate, and most of his history, as I've repeated, matches with known events and inscriptions of the first century. Let's begin with a good happy hunting ground for some of the critics. In the days of Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken. Problem number one, do the Romans have regular censuses? Well, many said they don't. Actually, Ramsey showed that the Romans, like any good government, they want to know how many people they've got in their borders. Why? Because they want to tax them. Don't think we invented taxation. It's always been there through all of human history. And the Roman government were no different. So they had regular censuses, no problem about that. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to his own town to register. Let's just deal with the Quirinius governor of Syria bit first of all. I can do a shorthand for you because you see there are two censuses, one in 6 BC and another one in 6 AD, and Quirinius was involved in both, and Luke records both. So Luke was also, remember, he's a good historian. He's not going to forget what he's already talked about. He's not going to muddle these two up. So how come Quirinius was involved in the first census, 6 BC, when in fact Josephus, the Jewish historian, a contemporary roughly with the apostles, Josephus claims that Sentius Saturninus was the administrative governor of Syria at the time. Well, without going into the details, the answer is quite simple. Quirinius was the military governor of the area, but he was away actually fighting battles on the Roman frontier at the time of the first census. But because he was the military governor, he was above, it was what was known by the Romans as a triumvirate, 2 men in office, but there always had to be one above the other. You can't have 2 men as equals. And so the military governor was the one above the other. Quirinius wasn't actually involved in the actual census itself. Sentius Saturninus was, but it was Quirinius's census because it was in his time as military governor. That's the short answer. And Ramsey goes into that in huge detail to demonstrate what he's saying. But what about everyone going to his own home to register? You see, we've got a modern Western view of it. You see, sitting in this small company here, you come from all over the place. Different countries, different parts of the United Kingdom. You've all traveled widely, many of you. But then people didn't. And it would be unusual for people to be a long way from home. And if they were, too bad. When it comes to the census, you've got to go back. No, surely not. Well, they did in Egypt anyway, because here is a census order in Egypt by Gaius Maximus in AD 104, ordering all men, this is in the time of the Roman Emperor Trajan, to return home for a census. So that's answered that question. Regular censuses, Quirinius was the military governor of a triumvirate, and yes, they did order men to go home, men to go home to register. Have you noticed, of course you have, in Luke chapter 3, with John, when John the Baptist began preaching, notice the names that Luke tumbles in. Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate, Herod Tetrarch of Galilee, Philip, Tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, Lysanias, Tetrarch of Abilene, and the high priests of Annas and Caiaphas. Why does he tumble all these names in? I don't need to know all this. Oh, yes, you do, says Luke. I want you to know exactly when John the Baptist started. I want you to know the period, history it's in. I don't want you to be mistaken. I've got the timing right. Yeah, but wait a moment. You can't have 2 high priests, Annas and Caiaphas. You got it wrong. Oh, no, he hasn't. And there's an irony in what he's saying here. You see, Annas had been made high priest, I think it was in the year 6. But in 15 AD, he was kicked out because he was totally corrupt and inept. All the high priests were, I'm afraid to say. But his son-in-law, Caiaphas, took over. And so Annas remained the power behind the throne. Can you see what Luke is saying? See, it was really the high priesthood of Caiaphas, but you all know that really it was the high priesthood of Annas continuing through his son-in-law. He knows exactly what he's saying. He's sketching in a little bit of history for us. There are 7 Herods in the New Testament. Have you ever got them muddled up? One of the Gnostic writers, the early false writings, got it muddled up because he thought the same Herod at Jesus' birth was the Herod at his death. Well, not quite. But there are 7 Herods in the New Testament. In the new book we're doing, we've unraveled them all. I've unraveled them all so you can put them all in their right place. But the interesting thing is Luke gets them all exactly in the right place and in the right area where it's relevant of their area of jurisdiction. He doesn't miss a trick. He's there all the way. And when it comes to the death of Herod Agrippa I, do you remember that account at the end of Acts 12? It's a pretty gruesome account. Herod Agrippa I went up to Caesarea, did a big speech, and everybody bowed down and said, "This is a God speaking. This is wonderful stuff." He had a beautiful robe that glistened in the sunlight, and he gave God no glory. And Luke actually says that he didn't give praise to God. An angel of the Lord struck him down, and he was eaten by worms and died. Oh, come on, that's a little bit of fanciful stuff on the part of Luke, isn't it? Because he's in a grumps with this man. Well, if you like, but Josephus, the Jewish historian, talks about exactly the same episode. He gives most of exactly the same details. He adds a few of his own, like the fact that the sun was shining on his garments and it sparkled brightly in the sun, and he saw an owl, which is an evil omen for him, and says Josephus, he suffered violent stomach pains and died 5 days later. The two stories fit together perfectly. Luke is not making up these details. He's demonstrating the truth. And when it comes to Pilate, now there was a time when people actually seriously questioned the existence of Pilate because we didn't have much information on this guy. Well, we do now. There's a little coin of his minted in his time. There's a ring of his that's been discovered more recently. And this actual lump of stone you have here, I'm sorry for those of you I'm standing in the way of it, but that lump of stone, it was actually in a temple that was built in honor of Tiberius, and Pilate put it there, and he actually dedicates it to Tiberius. But then in the 3rd century, it was converted into a theatre, and not being any respecter of persons, they took this dedication to Tiberius and made it part of a stairway, and that's where it was found. But again, it mentions Pilate as the governor. There's no question about that. As another one of my little asides, I'm intrigued by this. Have you noticed when you've been reading through Luke's Gospel, twice he he doesn't invent. It's there. Why would he invent it? An argument between the disciples. Luke 9, an argument started among the disciples as to which of them would be the greatest. That's bad enough. Can you imagine the disciples squabbling about who would be greatest? You can look at that positively, that they weren't talking about, I'm going to be the greatest, but saying, no, Peter, you'll be the greatest. That's a nice way of looking at it. But it was an argument. And then he comes back to it in Luke 22, a dispute among them as to which of them was considered to be greatest. Now, whichever way you look at it, kindly or unkindly, why on earth would you put that in? These are your heroes. These are the bedrock of the gospel. These are the pillars of the church. And they're arguing and squabbling. Well, the obvious reason is because it happened that way. And Luke, being an accurate historian, gives you some of the detail as well. Let's come into the Acts of the Apostles. It's packed with historical references. We're going to sort of pick up from the time when Paul, Saul of Tarsus, stoned Stephen, stood by while Stephen was being stoned, and forever must have regretted that when he writes to Timothy and says, I am the chief of sinners. Don't think that was some kind of false piety. I always believe when he wrote that, he put his quill down and leaned forward and wept. I was there. I gave permission silently for them to stone the first Christian martyr. He never forgot it. But Luke was a companion for most of Paul's travels, at least from Acts 16. The we passages begin, well known. We got ready to leave for Macedonia. And shall I tell you what really first began Ramsay on the transition from a critic of the Bible, Luke's history, to an acceptance that he was accurate, something you will never have noticed. Something that was, for most of us, we would simply pass by and never realize the possibility of an error. You see, Paul and Barnabas, we are told, fled from Iconium to the Lycaonian cities of Lystra and Derbe. Now, it was assumed at that time that Iconium was, in fact, the capital city of Lycaonia. So it's a bit odd to say he went from Iconium to Lycaonia. It would be a little bit like somebody saying, I left Newcastle and went to Northumbria. And you'd say, well, I think you got your geography a little bit wrong. Didn't you know that Newcastle is actually in Northumbria? That was a critical situation. He'd got it wrong. Now, I'd never noticed that till I read Ramsay, because I missed that one completely. I didn't realize it. Well, no, you would, but the critics got onto it. It implies that they crossed a frontier into Lycaonia, because it was believed, I say, that Iconium was the lead city, the chief city of Lycaonia, so Luke had made a historical blunder. Ramsay discovered that until the year AD 372, Iconium wasn't part of Lycaonia at all. It belonged to Phrygia, an entirely different district of Asia Minor with a different language. And you will notice another detail that Luke gives you when he says, when they're at Lystra, they cried out in the Lycaonian language. He's well aware. We're not in Phrygia now, you realize. We've now moved. We're in Lycaonia. See how accurate he is for those who can understand. And Ramsay began to wonder, that's what started him on the path, and he began to wonder, I wonder if Luke is as meticulous there everywhere else. I must take you to Lystra and Athens. Many of you will know this, and forgive me for repeating a story. But when the crowd saw that what Paul had done in healing the lame man in Lystra, they shouted out in the Lycaonian language, because we're now in Lycia, we've left Phrygia, the gods have come down to us in human form. Barnabas they called Zeus, that was the Greek name, the Romans called him Jupiter, and Paul they called Hermes because he was the chief speaker. Now there's a little story that lies behind that. Do you know it? It's the story of Philemon and Baucis. The story in the legends of Lystra was that many centuries before, the two gods had come down to test out the hospitality of the people on earth because they were a miserable, stingy, meaning lot. Still are. But anyway, the two gods, Zeus and Mercury, Zeus and Hermes, or Jupiter and Mercury as the Romans knew them, they came down to test them out. They went through Lystra, and the doors were shut. They dressed as poor, bedraggled wanderers, and the doors were shut. And they came to a poor couple in a little cottage at the edge, Philemon and Baucis, and they welcomed them in and entertained them, having no idea who they were. Lovely little story. It goes on about how they gave them all that they had, and they didn't quite realize until a little bit later all the food kept replenishing. They were just about to kill their favorite goose who guarded the house when the gods revealed themselves to them. The whole city was destroyed, and these two were allowed to live in a beautiful temple until they died and they were converted into two lovely trees. That's the basic story behind it. Now, when these two apostles came and they did these wonderful miracles, the people thought, the gods have come back. Better give them good hospitality or the same will happen again. That's the story behind Lystra. Luke knew that story. He was well aware of it. And when they came to Athens, there's a story behind the unknown God. Do you know that one as well? The unknown God, the altar to the unknown God, Agnostotheo. It's a story of Epimenides from Crete and the plague of Athens. There was a time, many centuries before, and this is one of their legends, when the plague had come to Athens. All the gods had failed to do anything about it, and very reluctantly, somebody said, we've got to get Epimenides from Crete, and they were a despised people. They were a people that everybody thought ill of. We've got to get Epimenides. He's one of their prophets. He'll come. So Epimenides was brought across. I won't go into all the story. He identified the god. He told them what sacrifices to offer, and the plague stopped. So they said, well, can we build a temple to this god? But he wouldn't tell them who the god was. In fact, all he asked was that there should be a peace treaty between Greece and Crete, between Athens and Knossos. And that's all. So just to be on the safe side, because you could do that then, you built an altar to the unknown God. Now, there were any number of gods in Athens. Somebody actually said at the time it was easier to find a god in Athens than a man. There were altars all over the place. And this was the background to the story of the unknown God. Paul, of course, beautifully capitalized on it. You read his sermon and see how he moves through apologetics into a biblical record. I could expound on that one again, but I won't. When Paul writes to Titus, he must have had something like this in mind when he spoke to Titus and said, even one of their own, the Cretes, describing the Cretes, even one of their own prophets, that's Epimenides, has said, Cretans are always liars, evil brutes, and lazy gluttons. This testimony, says Paul, is true. Actually, that phrase, Cretans are always liars, evil brutes, and lazy gluttons, is known as the liar's paradox. Because if that is a statement that is given by Epimenides, who was a Cretan, then he was lying, because all Cretans were liars. Anyway, that's an aside that you can forget immediately. So they come to Cyprus. And Paul and Barnabas arrive at Paphos on Cyprus. And again, Luke is specifically careful to tell us that Sergius Paulus is the proconsul at Paphos. He describes him as an intelligent man. Well, of course he was, because he accepted the gospel. An inscription discovered in 1877 near Paphos in Cyprus confirms that Sergius Paulus, you can see his name right there in here, and he is the governor of the island. He is the proconsul, that was his correct title, and Luke gives him that. This confirms that he was the proconsul there in AD 47, which is exactly the year that Paul and his party would have been there. And Luke is careful to give the leaders of each city the correct title. Now, we're a bit boring here in this country because we have a town council. You can go anywhere you like, certainly in England anyway, and they have a town council. There's no other name for them, town council. But in the New Testament, in the Acts of the Apostles across Asia Minor, it wasn't like that. At Philippi, they were called the strategoi. And everywhere you go, he gives you exactly the right title. At Ephesus, they are called the Asiarchon. In Malta, it's the protos, the chief man who is in charge. And in Thessalonica, they are the politarchos. Now, interestingly, on this last one, this was discovered as part of a gateway into the city. It's a 2nd century plaque in Thessalonica. And the very first word of it is rather a long mouthful, politarchunton. It actually refers to the politarchs. And interestingly, there are a number of people on this relief that actually their names are found in the New Testament. They're not the same people because it's too late. But it shows that the names were local names of people in Thessalonica. And when they came to Corinth, he was in Corinth for some 18 months. And it was here he mentions that Claudius had ordered the Jews to leave Rome. Now, the Roman historian Suetonius actually tells us that he ordered them out between the years AD 41 to 45 because there were squabbles between the Jews and one called Chrestus, That's a clear reference to Christ, Christians, those belonging to Christ. Of course, the Christ deniers. Remember, there are people today who don't believe that Jesus ever lived, believe it or not. There are still people who believe the earth is flat, for that matter, but they don't believe that Jesus ever lived. And they will say that doesn't refer to the Christians, but they haven't got any other name to put there. They don't know who this other Christos would be. And we know for a fact that there were squabbles going on, that Claudius didn't like this, so he threw all the Jews out. Now, there were a lot of Jews at that time in Rome. They reckon there must have been something like 40,000 Jews in Rome, and that's when Aquila and Priscilla were thrown out of Rome as well. And Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, that's Greece. He was appointed by Claudius in AD 51. Luke gets that right as well. And that's the exact year that Paul was in Corinth. They fit perfectly. In fact, this is an inscription found in 1905 referring to Gallio as proconsul in Greece. And it actually says on this inscription, he was trying to settle quarrels among the citizens. I don't know whether you know this, but Gallio was actually the brother to Seneca, the philosopher who was a tutor to Nero, the Emperor Nero, and Nero ordered him to commit suicide because of, I think he was innocent actually, but he accused him of an assassination plot. And one of the things you can say about Seneca is that he had a very high moral standard. And one of the things he encouraged people to do was be friendly and brotherly to everybody. And it's interesting that his brother Gallio, proconsul in Achaia in Greece, was trying to settle quarrels among the citizens. And when the Apostle Paul was on trial in front of Gallio, you remember it was Gallio who said, look, if this is a religious squabble you've got, I want nothing to do with it. Sort it out yourselves. And I think that's his brother speaking, saying, don't get involved in arguing about this sort of thing. I'll skip a bit quickly over this. In Ephesus, this is a model, supposed, of the beautiful temple of Artemis, Diana, as the Romans knew her. She was the goddess, the patron saint of little children, childbirth, hunting. She's often seen with hunting dogs. Brother of Apollo, if you're into Greek mythology. Twins, they were, sister of Apollo, and they were twins. And the temple in Jerusalem, in Ephesus, was very, very significant because it was a little parliament of its own. It was a place of refuge, a bit like the biblical cities used to be a place of refuge. It didn't stop Cleopatra from having her sister assassinated there on one occasion, but that was Cleopatra. But generally, you were protected if you went there as a place of refuge. But it was the center of worship across the Roman world of Diana, and people came from all over the Roman Empire to worship Diana. And of course, Demetrius was, with his colleagues, was making a big business out of this. They were making little silver. I've got one for you here. If I can find her. There she is. She's actually only about that big, and a little silver model of her. She looks rather modern, actually, with her little short skirt and bun and high-heeled shoes, but that's a 2nd century image of Diana. And the cry, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians," which he records very carefully, it was well known in the ancient world. Great is the Diana of the Ephesians. When Sir Mob took to the streets, as they do periodically all over the world, this would be their cry. Today, however, all you have in Ephesus of Diana's beautiful white marble temple is a lonely column in a muddy pool. But where is Paul's gospel? All over the world. Oh, there are bits of her temple in museums all over the world, but that's all there. On to Jerusalem. There's a little story behind what happened to Trophimus. Now, Trophimus was a Greek, and he teamed up with Paul, and some people had thought, quite erroneously, that Paul had taken Trophimus into the forbidden precincts of the temple, where only Jews were allowed to go. and they caused a riot about that. Now, Paul wouldn't have done that because he wasn't in the habit of deliberately breaching the sensitivities of the Jews. And there was no reason why he would have taken him there. But interestingly, this statement was found. It was a lump of stone was found in Jerusalem in 1871, and there was a notice carved on it in Greek so that every Gentile would be able to read it, and it formed the boundary of that forbidden area. The Greek was painted in red. Pigment was still there, but if you want a Greek English translation, it read, "No foreigner may pass the barrier and enclosure surrounding the temple. Anyone who's caught doing so will himself be to blame for his resulting death." And I believe that that's exactly what caused the trouble. And I believe this is what Paul had in mind when he wrote to Ephesians 2:14, Jesus has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility. He would have had the very stone you're looking at in his mind when he wrote that. So Paul is taken into custody to rescue him from Sir Mob. And Luke is very careful to record that it was Claudius Lysias, the tribune in command of the cohort. A cohort was 600 men, which is 1/10 of a Roman legion. Now, there are three things in that story that are significant. One is the reference to the Egyptian, the other is the assassination plot, and the other is the final escort to Caesarea. And interestingly, Luke seems to understand all of them. The tribune says there's that little conversation beforehand. How did you get Roman citizenship, Paul? I had to pay a lot of money for mine. Actually, I, said Paul, was born a Roman citizen in the city of Tarsus. Now, immediately, in the social standing, it put Paul above the tribune, because to be born a citizen was a little bit more important than buying it. So that kind of put him a leg up there, if you like, and meant that the two men were talking more on equal terms, even though he was a high-ranking Roman officer. But then he said, but I thought you were the Egyptian. That's an interesting reference, because Josephus, the historian, writing of the same the same period, refers to an Egyptian, Ben Stado, who took, he says, 30,000 men out into the desert until the Romans got him and captured him, slaughtered a whole load of people. That's who the tribune thought he was. Now, the interesting thing there is that Luke says there were 4,000. That's what the Claudius Lysias says. Josephus says 30,000. Josephus, by all historians, would say is way over the top there. Actually, 30,000 would be more than the entire number of Roman troops billeted in Judea at that time. And therefore that's very unlikely. 4,000 is a much more realistic picture, and Luke is only quoting Claudius Lysias, so that's where he got his information from. And then there's the assassination plot. Now you will have heard of the Zealots. The Zealots, of course, were a sub-bracket of the Pharisees, and they were a ruthless bunch. They were the modern terrorists. It's a lovely fact, isn't it? And you all know this, that Jesus called one of the Zealots and one of the, there's a generation here wouldn't know what I'm talking about, one of the Quislings, one of the people in league with the Roman authorities, and brought them both into the same party. Now, the Zealots were at Dragon Drawn, and a section of the Zealots were called the Sicarii. The Sicarii were named after a little curved dagger that they kept under their belt, and they would plunge it into the back or the front of anyone who was in league with Rome. And these were the Sicarii, almost certainly, who were in the assassination plot. By the providence of God, the tribune gets to hear of this, and then he orders a very over-the-top escort to go. And it's quite interesting how Luke refers to them. There were 200 heavy infantry, 70 cavalry, and 200 lightly armed spearmen. I haven't properly illustrated the spearman. That is not a spearman. That's an ordinary Roman heavily armed legionary. But that is exactly the three sections of the Roman army: the heavy infantry, the cavalry, the lightly armed spearmen. And that's rather a lot of people. And if you do your geography, you will see that they traveled fast, because the journey from Jerusalem to Caesarea was 74 miles. He knew, the Tribune knew, that somehow the plotters, the Sicarii, were going to be in the first half of the journey. That's why once they got to Antipatris, he dismissed the infantry and the cavalry went on alone. And that's very interesting, because you say, well, hang on, most of these guys are on foot, and that means they had to walk a long way fast. Yes, and I say this at the risk of being shot by any Marines or ex-Marines here. The Roman infantry made our Marines look like wimps. They could travel fast with a huge pack. When they had all their gear together, they had about 70 pounds of gear. That's a lot of gear. That's much more than your baggage carry stuff that you put in the hold of an aircraft. They had that much on their back. And they could cover at least 25 to 30 miles in 5 hours. That's more than 4 miles an hour. And on a forced march, they could do more. There are stories of Caesar marching his army incredible distances fast. So there's nothing wrong with that story. Big distances, yes, but the Roman infantry were tough. They were really tough. He gets that right. And so to Rome. You'll be glad to know we're nearly at an end. But this is very important, and it's something that you may never have realized. He sent him, and again you see how careful Luke is. He records not only the name of the people, he gives the name of the officers. He went under the care of Julius, a centurion. Now this would be, and he tells him he was of the imperial cohort. Now this would be a cohort officer courier. They had officers that were particularly assigned to these kind of communications between the empire. But what is more significant is this. The journey to Rome is written in detail. It's one of the most exciting chapters in the Bible, chapter 28 and 27, 28. And it's the whole journey to Rome. This is the kind of ship that he would be on, but this is what I want to draw your attention to. A book was written published in 1848 by James Smith. You may never have heard of it, but make a note of it. Go online. You can read it if you want to. It was called The Voyage and Shipwreck of St. Paul. 370 pages of it, although to be fair, a lot of that is describing ancient shipping of the time. But James Smith was 60 years a professional sailor. He's got an idea about sailing. Educated at Glasgow University, a scholar in Greek, Latin, and many languages, a student of geology, archaeology, and a well-known authority then and still an authority of ancient ships and shipping. And he has written every detail of that journey, the tides, the winds. He's taken you through everything Luke says. And Luke's account is considered to be the finest piece of eyewitness account of a shipwreck ever recorded, and accurate in every detail. Any historian who knows anything about James Smith and his book will have to agree with that. It's recognized by all academics of New Testament studies that Smith's is a book of a masterpiece and a perfect vindication of Luke's accuracy as a historian. I'm just going to give you a little synopsis of his conclusion. No sailor, he says, would have written in a style so little like that of a sailor. However, no man not a sailor could have written the narrative of the sea voyage so consistent in all its parts unless from actual observation. So he says, I could tell Luke wasn't a sailor because of the way he writes. I could tell he was there because no one could have written like that who wasn't there. The detail is so exact. This peculiarity of style is to me in itself a demonstration that the narrative of the voyage is an account of real events written by an eyewitness, A similar remark may be made on the geographical details. They must have been taken from an actual observation, for the geographical knowledge of the age was not such as to enable a writer to be so minutely accurate in any other way. In other words, there were no charts available that enabled him to be as accurate as that. You could write a make-believe shipwreck today from anywhere if you were so inclined, because all the nautical charts are available for anywhere, but they weren't then. But he gets his exact, even to the point where Luke specifically says that they threw the rudders out at the stern. And he says that is a most unusual thing to do. But under the circumstances, knowing the way the wind was blowing and the way the tide was flowing, that was exactly the thing to do, not the bows, the stern. Otherwise it would have swung broadside and smashed against the rocks. In other words, he says, I'm reading this with 60 years of experience behind me, and nobody would have said that. They would have made up, they threw the anchors out at the bow, which is normally where they go. Why did he say the stern? Because that's where they were. That's where they threw them out, because they knew what was happening. Luke's account and Smith's detailed analysis are of the greatest significance. If this is the character of Luke as a historian, then his gospel and the rest of Acts must be held in equal respect. Remember Sir William Ramsay? He said, you may press the words of Luke in a degree beyond any other historians, and they stand the keenest scrutiny and the hardest treatment. Christianity did not originate in a lie, and we can and ought to demonstrate this as well as believe it. You've all noticed, haven't you, that the Acts of the Apostles doesn't conclude, it just stops. And you think, come on, Luke, finish it off. Now, there are any number of reasons why he might have finished where he did, and we can discuss those if you want to in Q&A. But Tertullian, one of the early church leaders around AD 200, tells us that Paul had a similar death to that of John the Baptist and was beheaded. But if all of this was true, every detail true, when he comes to the account of the resurrection, why would he suddenly go off into myths and fables? For 2,000 years, Christians have been prepared to die for the certainty that Jesus is alive, and the evidence demands a response. But one last feature of Luke, and as a matter of fact it's all the Gospels, is this. When it comes to the resurrection account, who are the ones who first saw Jesus alive and brought the news? If you're making up the story of the resurrection, you would be the most dullest person on earth, with due respect to you ladies here, to put women in the forefront. Josephus, who I've been quoting, said, a woman's word is nothing like that of a man's because of the fickleness of her character. Sorry, that's Josephus. But that's how they felt about women. Why on earth would you put the women, and all four gospel writers do, at the very forefront, so that even when the women go to the disciples and say, we've seen Jesus alive, they say, yes, I know you're all a bit wound up, aren't you? We're all a bit like that. Forget it, my dear, forget it. Why do they keep doing it? There's only one reason, isn't it? I'm sorry, but truth has to be told. I wish it was Peter. I wish it was John. I wish it was one of the other men. And then everybody might believe us. It's just the women. And God sits in heaven and laughs and says yes. Because the women are more open to the truth than you men are. So, I repeat as I said before, go to the little garden tomb and sit there in the quietness and realize that Jesus did really rise again from the dead, or as Paul puts it, Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. He was buried and he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. If you want a little booklet on the resurrection, it's out there. Is it true? The resurrection of Jesus. I'll tell you about those little booklets in a moment if you want to, but let's see if there's time for any Q&A.
Well, it's truly thrilling, isn't it? It's thrilling because it's truth, and it's life-changing truth. This isn't just history. This is life-changing history. So we are going to take a moment for Q&A, but we haven't got ever so long. So if you have a question, let us know straight away over here. Brad, thank you very much. Simon.
Thank you ever so much for that. And just to express my huge appreciation for your work, I took my father-in-law, minister, on a tour of the British Museum with your book, and it was a fascinating day, and I recommend anybody to do it. Can I just ask you about Ramsey? You said that modern critics ask a lot of the questions that Ramsey has already answered, and they ignore him, and you teased that there might be one or two more things you could say about that. Would you be willing to do that?
Yes, thank you for your initial comments. Actually, my teasing was really with somebody else, not Ramsey. But I'm just trying to, I can tell you the other one in a moment, but I'm just trying to think of something from Ramsey. I think, the Quirinius is one, classic one, because Quirinius still comes up. You will probably all have had people say, "Hi, he got it wrong with Quirinius, didn't he? He thought Quirinius was involved in 2 censuses, and of course we all know Quirinius wasn't. He was only involved in 1, and that sort of thing is still churned out. But I'll tell you what I was thinking of, and actually it was John A.T. Robinson. Some of you are old enough to remember Honest to God, the book that everybody was talking about and nobody had read. John A.T. Robinson, before he died, wrote a very, very interesting book way back in 1979, and it was called Redating the New Testament. Now, he was a thorough-going liberal critic. Get that? New Testament scholar, liberal critic. And he wrote a book showing that all the New Testament was complete before the year AD 70. And he minutely dissected every book of the New Testament to demonstrate that. And he was a well-known New Testament scholarly critic. So everybody had to take him somewhat seriously. His big punch point was interesting because it was a point that evangelical Christians have been using for years. And he came to the startling conclusion that the big date in the 1st century was AD 70, when the Romans destroyed the temple and Jerusalem. And that was the end of physical Judaism based on a temple. They had to become a people of the book after that. And he said there isn't one hint that that's accomplished in the New Testament. Jesus prophesied it, but not a hint it's accomplished. So therefore they must all have been. Now actually that was even more conservative than conservative evangelicals, because some believe that John may have written his Gospel and the book of Revelation after AD 70. That's neither here nor there. It was very interesting. But what he said again and again in his book was most significant. He said, I came to realize that most critics, many critics, are simply churning out the decisions, the conclusions they have already come to from a preconceived idea. And he talked about and these are his words, the tyranny of unexamined assumptions. And he said the danger of the critics is they simply pick up what one critic has said and they put it down and they follow on. That's what he meant by the tyranny of unexamined assumptions. And that's what I meant by the fact that people just ignore what is said and they just pick it up and they follow it on. And critics do that all the time. We can do that, and that's where fake news comes in. You don't examine it. You just accept it because it's exciting. Sorry, I may have teased you in the wrong direction there. But it is true. Bruce said it. Somebody else whose name comes to just slipped out of my mind, another scholar who did his PhD on Ramsey, and he said exactly the same thing. And I discovered that myself. I look sometimes for footnotes saying, where's Ramsey? Because he's had something to say on this.